So welcome to this ACUR at ANU session, Cognition and Psychology. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose lands we meet and pay respect to the elders past and present. My name is Aidan Delaney and I will be chairing today's session. Our first presenter for today is Dot Pagram. So please start when you're ready.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dot Pagram and I'm currently a third-year undergraduate at the Australian National University. Today, I'll be presenting my research on the topic of measuring cognitive dysfunction in ME/CFS, myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, and within long COVID. I'll be focusing on the importance of highly sensitive neuropsychological tasks. I would first like to thank Professor Eleanor McCone for providing me this research opportunity and guiding me through the process, and Associate Professor Anne Amola Davies for her expertise in grouping neuropsychological tasks. Now, I'll start by providing you some context for this research area. In 2010, the Institute of Medicine, IOM, specified that a patient must meet 4 core criteria to be diagnosed as having CFS. These criteria are over 6 months of extreme fatigue that is disproportionate to activities and not relieved by rest, post-exertional malaise, which refers to crashes after physical or cognitive exertion, unrefreshing sleep, and neurocognitive problems and/or orthostatic intolerance. The latter refers to worsening symptoms whilst seated or standing upright. The prevalence of CFS is being exacerbated by the current COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. As more COVID-19 survivors reach the post-viral 6-month mark, many are subsequently being diagnosed with CFS. The sheer number of individuals globally infected by COVID-19 means that understanding CFS symptom profiles and developing appropriate treatments is something that needs to be of research focus right now. This review focuses on the core CFS symptom of neurocognitive dysfunction, which is commonly assessed via subjective patient self-reports. However, neuropsychological task performance is an alternative objective measure to quantify cognitive impairment in CFS patients. The current study focuses on synthesizing the literature on task performance in CFS patients compared to healthy control groups. It aims to update conclusions from previous reviews of cognitive functioning in CFS, identify what tasks are the most sensitive and reliable for detecting objective impairment in the CFS population, and critically analyse past literature to determine common limitations in methods used and guide future studies in the field. I'll now draw your attention to the methods box. The current study was a critical literature review and followed the search process of choosing databases, search dates and search terms, and then determining inclusion criteria. Notably, studies must have included adult participants consisting of a CFS patient group and a healthy control group, as well as an objective test of cognition. A total of 52 studies and 81 different neuropsychological tasks were included in this review. Cognitive tasks were grouped into functional domains, similar to how it was grouped in Cockshell and Matthias's 2010 review. This allowed for consistent comparisons in the findings of task sensitivity. Now, bringing your attention to the results section. In the 2010 review, Cockshell and Matthias calculated effect sizes of each of the 6 functional cognitive domains. The interpretation of these results indicated some cognitive domains are more impaired in CFS than others. The figure I've presented here visually represents their findings. The 3 cognitive domains perceived as the most impaired in CFS are reaction time, attention, and memory. However, throughout the data extraction process, I noted that these effect sizes don't necessarily reflect the most impaired domains, but rather the cognitive domains which have been most frequently utilised in the studies. Through analysis of the literature, I noticed some patterns and potentially more relevant findings than these simple cognitive domain differences. I'll now describe the 5 main findings of the current review. Firstly, cognitive dysfunction is widespread across cognitive domains. Bring the domains up so you can see again. Almost every domain includes some tasks with significant performance differences in CFS patients compared to controls, in the direction of patients being more impaired. This finding of widespread dysfunction is expected as it aligns with the neurophysiological correlates of CFS. Secondly, the single most sensitive task for detecting cognitive deficits in CFS is the Stroop task. Studies consistently report significant differences at the p less than 0.05 level, with patient performance being poorer than controls. I'll briefly describe the Stroop task for those of you without a psychology background. It's also on the screen here. So the Stroop task usually involves 3 stages: participants reading colour words in black ink, then naming colours presented, and lastly, naming the colour of the word when the word reads as a different colour. So I've included a couple of Stroop examples you can try on this poster here. With the first example, note that it's difficult to name the colour green when the word is reading blue. This requires inhibition and executive function. Stroop also requires reaction time and attention. Note that the Stroop is also both a visual and a speeded task. By speeded task, I mean that it has a reaction time measure. This brings me to the next finding. I noticed a results pattern where visual tasks are more sensitive than auditory tasks. This pattern was particularly apparent with tasks such as simple reaction time, which have been utilised with either a visual or an auditory stimulus. The fourth pattern I noticed was that tasks with a speeded component are more sensitive than those without. This is consistent with past literature and explains why some domains are less frequently identified as impaired. Indeed, recent studies, including language and visuospatial tasks with speeded components, have identified significant impairment in CFS patients. The final finding is that most studies likely underestimate cognitive impairment in the CFS population by testing only mild patients on their highest functioning days, so not during a post-exertional malaise crash. So, what are the take-home messages of this review? First, it's time to move the research on from debating most impaired cognitive domains to accepting that dysfunction is widespread and utilising consistently sensitive Stroop tasks for patient care. Objectively validating patient experiences of symptoms via the Stroop task may be a key to the puzzle of helping patients to live healthier and happier lives. Re-administration of this task at different time points can help patients and clinicians to track cognitive dysfunction over time, which may help to identify triggers for cognitive crashes and can inform management plans to minimise symptom exacerbation in the future. The Stroop task can also be used as an outcome measure to establish the efficacy of CFS treatments, especially those targeting neurocognitive symptoms. This is essential as there's currently no cure for CFS. As for future directions in research, it would be great to find more consistently sensitive tasks in CFS that can be used as Stroop alternatives. The findings from this review of the differential performance impairment with stimulus types and time pressures can be used to guide this research, particularly in the visuospatial and language domains. Future research should also focus on representing the true cognitive deficits that exist in the CFS population via improving study designs to incorporate CFS features. This may look like including CFS patients with moderate and severe symptom profiles, and testing patients at multiple time points and during these cognitive crash days. As a final note, as COVID spreads, so does CFS. Please stay COVID safe and get vaccinated, because the health impacts of contracting COVID-19 may not stop when you're virus-free, and the long-term consequences of CFS can be life-changing. Thank you for taking the time to zoom into my presentation today. I'll now take any questions, and if you'd like to contact me later, feel free to send me an email.
Thank you for that. We now have 5 minutes for Q&A. I'll start by inviting the judges if you have any questions.
Sure, I can go. So thank you for that presentation, Dot. That was really interesting. I'm just wondering if how you actually synthesize the results. So you've sort of presented some really clear results, but I'm just wondering how they were actually synthesized and how you made sort of decisions to say things like visual tasks are more sensitive than auditory tasks.
I can share a screen of my data collection if that's helpful at all.
No, that's okay. Maybe just describe it quickly.
Okay, I'll describe it. So basically, I looked at all of these different papers and found out, first determined if I was going to include the papers. A big part of that was the criteria of having CFS in the first place, because lots of them use outdated criteria. So that knocked a lot of papers out. Then what I did was looked for if they were testing cognitive function through neuropsychological tasks. So there were so many different tasks. As I mentioned, there were 81 in the end. So then I grouped these tasks into domains, 6 cognitive domains that were used in a previous review. So this is kind of an updated review on the literature since the one in 2010. So I kept consistent by kind of using their areas of grouping, knowing that most of these tasks do utilize multiple different cognitive functions. And for example, the Stroop task, it isn't just an attention task, but it's grouped under that domain. And then I looked at how many studies, I coded how many studies use that particular task, and then looked at the significant differences levels. So this one used the p less than 0.05, and that was considered significant. So I determined that. And then I just kind of looked at the numbers and saw how many studies use particular tasks, how many were significant. We also ended up actually looking at the trends, because it was found that even though studies didn't find significant differences in some tasks, they were trending in a direction of impairment in CFS patients. And this is probably because they only use mild patients in the tasks in the first place. But yeah, that was kind of the process of it. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you for that. You presented a very succinct results section. I was just wondering about the process behind it. So thank you for explaining that.
No problem at all. It was hard to convey it on a poster form because there's so many different tasks and I couldn't possibly put them all on there.
Are there any further questions?
I have a small question, sort of a very small one. If I have time, that'd be fine.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yep. Yeah. So you already mentioned in the implications that you are trying to identify some alternative sensitive tasks other than Stroop. Have you already identified any other tasks? Like, can you name any?
So the Stroop task was the only task which was used by a lot of studies. So it had sufficient data and was significant in almost all of these studies. So it was utilized by at least 14 studies. Most of the other tasks were utilized only maybe 4 times. So the data isn't as strong there. But when I looked further in and discussed with some experts on grouping neuropsychological tasks, and found that the speeded and the speeded and the visual tasks, there was kind of you could see it on the spreadsheet that speeded and visual tasks were more impaired. I could see that that's probably an area where research needs to focus on. Next year, I'll be starting my honours, so hopefully I'll be able to continue on this research then. And there's a lot of new studies that are coming out in the past year or two on specific domains, with including these speeded components, which are finding more significant results, such as even like reading speed is significantly impaired in patients with CFS compared to controls. So maybe incorporating a task like as simple as that in the future.
Okay. We are at
Perfect.
time, so
Thank
I'll
you.
have to end the presentation there. Thank you for that presentation. And I'll now move to invite our next presenter, Georgia Acutt, if you'd like to start when you're ready.
Can everyone see that? Okay. So, hi, my name's Georgia Acutt. I'm currently undertaking a Bachelor of Psychology Honours at the University of the Sunshine Coast. As a part of my honours dissertation, I look to understand the psychological outcomes of pole dancers. This study is the first to quantify psychological outcomes associated with pole participation and compare outcomes to other more well-known recreational dance forms. Pole dancing as a recreational activity is becoming increasingly more mainstream. However, much of the public are still unaware of the activity and its many physical and mental health benefits. Globally, pole dancing has moved from nightclubs to competitions as it transitions from a sexual commodity to an athletic art form. Still, many people can't shake the image of the pole dancing stripper. Despite this, many women have reported significant improvements in their fitness, body image, and confidence because of pole dancing, making them feel sexy, strong, and empowered. Even so, many people still view pole dancing as a taboo sexual activity that objectifies women. Research suggests that this reported stigma associated with pole strengthens the bonds between polers and creates a sisterhood, such that pole classes embody an environment of acceptance and inclusion. A recent news article sums up the phenomena quite simply by suggesting that pole is what you make of it, an exercise class, a feminist pursuit, or a space to practice elaborate tricks. Despite this, there is still a limited understanding of the phenomenon of pole, including the increase in participation. Polers have emphasised qualitatively how pole allows for control and unique capability, confidence and achievement in the body's functionality, and that pole classes foster an environment of support. The motivations for pole participation reported in research align with principles of self-determination theory, where satisfaction of three basic psychological needs, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, are known to foster a raft of positive wellbeing outcomes. I aim to understand the increase in the popularity of pole to quantify psychological outcomes previously reported in qualitative studies, whilst comparing results with other forms of recreational dance. I had a community sample of 282 recreational dancers aged 18 to 71, comprising a 95% female population, all of which voluntarily completed an anonymous online survey regarding their dance experiences, self-esteem, subjective well-being, and body image. Of the sample, 64% were pole dancers and 23% were dancers, which included dance forms such as ballet, tap, jazz, contemporary, hip-hop, ballroom, folk dance, and Irish dance. Unexpectedly, 12% of participants stated that they identified as dancers because they engaged in Zumba or burlesque recreationally. These participants comprised the unique grouping, which I titled Other. I utilised self-determination theory and the serious leisure perspective to understand the underlying psychological outcomes potentially promoting an increase in pole participation. Self-determination theory is a leading theory of motivation, which assumes that humans are actively oriented to develop, willingly initiating action with reference to personal interests and values, occasionally integrating societal practices and norms to ultimately pursue personal goals, striving for mastery. For optimal development and functioning to occur, we must satisfy three basic psychological needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Therefore, the first aim of my study was to identify whether polers experience higher satisfaction of autonomy, competence, and relatedness compared to other recreational dancers. Satisfaction of these basic psychological needs may help explain pole's popularity, particularly if polers report higher need satisfaction than other dancers. My study revealed that among polers, recreational dancers, and others, there was no significant difference between dance forms on measures of basic psychological needs. However, all groups perceived their needs to be satisfied. Because satisfaction of autonomy, competence, and relatedness needs foster increased self-esteem, positive body image, and subjective well-being, the second aim of my study was to identify whether polers experience differential psychological outcomes compared to other recreational dancers. The experience of better psychological outcomes may help explain pole's popularity. The current study found no significant differences among polers and other recreational dancers when considering body image. However, surprisingly, others reported higher self-esteem, lower negative affect, and higher overall perceived benefits of dance when compared to polers and dancers. Pole participation plausibly satisfies innate autonomy, relatedness, and competence needs, and activities that satisfy these basic needs are intrinsically rewarding and are thus more likely to become serious leisure pursuits. Therefore, polers' perception of pole as serious leisure was considered. Serious leisure is the systematic pursuit of an amateur or hobbyist where participation is so substantial, interesting, and fulfilling that they launch themselves on a leisure career. Most paramount to serious leisure is the development of special skills, knowledge, and experience, which can take months or years to develop and often leads to mastery and accomplishment. Interestingly, all participants of my study identified that they saw participation in their choice of recreational dance to be a form of serious leisure. As such, this perception may plausibly be linked to why all participants were experiencing overall positive psychological well-being. Commitment to serious leisure generates a portfolio of benefits, including self-actualization, confidence, belongingness, individuality, recovery, mastery, competence, and subjective well-being. The quality of participants' motivation may be described through the perspective of serious leisure, which has an apparent relationship with self-determination theory. Overall, consistent with positive psychology perspectives, this study highlights the importance that engagement in any exercise perceived enjoyable tends to produce substantial positive outcomes. Positive psychology is important because discovering what leads people to live more meaningful lives can translate to better strategies for managing mental illness, correcting negative behaviours, and increasing happiness and productivity. A few future research considerations have been deliberated, including a larger male sample size. While our research was being conducted, a national competition for male pole dancers was being held. I reached out to all participants within this competition, and my participation collection concluded with only 9 males, and not all were pole dancers. Therefore, there is a space for further consideration of the psychological outcomes associated with males' participation in pole dance and potentially differences among gender. A consideration for a longitudinal study to see if psychological outcomes change over time with participation in pole. And lastly, future research may consider psychological outcomes associated with Zumba and burlesque. Potentially, it may hold similar characteristics reported by pole participants, such as positive body image, embodiment, and a supportive community. Thank you for your time. I'd now like to invite questions.
Thank you for that. We now have 5 minutes for Q&A. I'll begin again by inviting the judges if you have any questions. If there are no questions from the judges, we'll also invite the audience. You can either put your questions in the chat or raise your hand so that we can unmute you.
I should say, like a interesting story. Since there are no questions, I mean, it doesn't mean that your talk is not good, okay? I was gonna ask you about a question about the gender difference between the pole dancers, how the physiological impact comes out, but you already answered that correctly. So overall, nice presentation. Good luck.
Thank you.
We have a question here in the chat. Do you expect that empowerment will be differentially represented in a male-dominated study of pole?
It's definitely something that we wanted to consider, but unfortunately without the male participants, it was hard. In all of the qualitative studies that I assessed, which wasn't many, they're largely female populations, despite them saying that pole is for everybody. So it is hard to suggest whether it would make a difference, particularly with the large female populations in all of the studies.
Okay, are there any further questions? Okay, then if we have no further questions, we might move on to the next presentation. Thank you again for that, Georgia. So I'd now like to welcome our next presenter, Chen. Nan, if you'd like to start when you're ready.
Hi, everybody. My name is Chen. I come from the Australia National University. Today, I'm going to introduce my study to you to showing you training using character faces can improve other race facial recognition. When I talk about other race facial recognition, there is one concept I need to introduce you first, the other race effect, ORE. What is ORE? As you can see from the top left corner of this poster, there are two faces here. This is Asian women and this is white women. They come from two different races. In the daily life, they may have difficulty in recognizing and identifying identify each other's faces. This phenomena is called other race effect. Here, I only use two pictures of female, but this phenomena does not only limit to female, it also applies to male. And actually, in the real world, it has been found all over the world in all race combination. And the previous study have already showed other race effect can lead very serious consequences. For example, for police officer, they may arrest wrong person in the criminal cases because of ORE. And for passport officer and for bartender, they may make wrong judgment because of ORE in the photo identification process. So it's very important for us to reduce the ORE to avoid these negative consequences. But how? There is one method called charactering in the facial recognition area. What is charactering? As you can see from my poster on the top right corner, there are two faces. The left one is normal face and the right one is character face. And charactering is to exaggerate the distinguished feature of the normal face compared with the average face. What does that mean? You see this person have very pointy nose and very thin lips. And charactering exaggerates this distinguished feature compared with natural face, compared with average face to make the nose pointier, to make the lips thinner. And charactering has been shown in the previous literature that it can improve facial recognition based on empirical evidence and theoretical evidence. However, previous training study trying to reduce ORE seldom use character faces in their study. Most of them use natural faces in their study and few of them are very effective. So that's the research gap my study is going to address. To investigate whether the training using character faces will reduce ORE, other race effect, which in turn improves people's ability in recognizing other race faces. And the exciting thing is this is the first study to do it. And the whole study is laid out as 4 parts. As you can see from the experimental flow chart here, the whole study is divided into pre-screening, pre-test, training, and post-test. And all the participants we recruit are all Asian students from the Australian National University. Let's take a look at the experimental flow here. In the pre-screening test, participants need to do 2 tasks. These 2 tasks are computer-based facial recognition tasks, CMFT original and CMFT Chinese. CMFT original, the tasks are the same, and the faces in the CMFT original are white faces, and in this version are Chinese faces. And they also need to do some questionnaires. And after participants finish the pre-screening, some of them are eligible to entering the following experiment. The criteria we use to decide whether the participants are eligible for the following experiment is to make sure they have normal ability of recognizing their own race faces, in this case, Asian face, and poor ability of recognizing white people's face, in this case is poor ability of recognizing other race faces, in this case, white people's face. And also they need to meet some certain demographic criteria. We recruit 46 participants and only 20 of them are eligible to enter the following experiment. And these 20 participants also finish PD mask task and similarity rating task. For the PD mask task, participants will sit in front of a computer and they were shown 2 faces of one person in sequence very quickly, each picture followed by a mask to increase the difficulty of the experiment. And then they will see a panel like this, and they need to choose which person you just saw by choosing one person among these 4 options. For the similarity rating task, these 2 pictures belongs to similarity rating task. Let's take a look at close-up. This one, there are 2 versions, Asian stimuli and white stimuli. Actually, in the real experiment, both stimuli are mixed. And we are here. Here, let's only take a look at only one version. These 3 pictures belongs to one person, and these 3 pictures belongs to another person. And participants need to rate how similar these 2 persons look on the scale 1 to 9. 1 means very similar, and 9 means very different. And after the participants finish these 2 tasks in the pre-test, they join in the training session, which is ORE training. This training session are 5 sessions of face name learning task, which means participants will see the faces like this one, the top right corner, the picture face like this. They will say faces like this and try to learn their names through feedback. And all the faces we use in the training phase are character face. And all the faces we use in the training phase are from different persons from the pre-test. After the participants finish the training session, they come to the post-test. In the post-test, there are 3 tasks: PD mask task, similarity rating task, and 2 CFMT tasks. These tasks are the same as the one in the pre-test, but the faces we use in the post-test are from the different person in the pre-test. And to keep in mind, the faces in pre-test, training test, and post-test, training phase, post-test are from different person in our experiment. I will come back to this point later. And after we've analyzing our data, this is the result of the PD mask task. The accuracy improved significantly after the training. And this is the similarity rating task. You can see from the picture, the gap is bigger which means white faces were rated much more different than Asian faces in the post-test. And this is the CMFT task performance. Participants perform better in both tasks. Since participants perform better in all the parameters we have in the post-test, we can come to the conclusion that our training with corrector faces can reduce ORE, which addressed our question in the beginning. And the most important thing is we also show the transfer of the training effect. Remember, I just mentioned in the experimental flow, the faces in the training are from different persons in the pre-test and post-test, which means the benefits you receive in the training does not only limited to the faces you receive in the training, but also applies to the faces in the post-test. Imagine the faces in the post-test are the faces you will meet in the real life. If you go to our lab, receive some training about some faces, you will improve your other race facial recognition in general in the real life, which is so exciting. Because previous literature already showed if you improve your facial recognition ability for other races, you have more self-esteem and more confidence when you're interacting with them. And this will lead you have better mental health and personal well-being. And the take-home message is our training study can reduce ORE and can improve your other race facial recognition. And the most important thing is if you come to our lab to receive some training, the benefits you get does not only limit to the faces we use in our experiments, but also applies to the faces you will meet in the daily life. And that's very exciting in my personal opinion. And there are some further information you can find, the reference list in this link. And this is my—
Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt, but the time for the presentation is up. We now have 5 minutes for Q&A. So I'll again invite the judges first if you have any questions.
I'll ask a question. I was just curious about the screening that you used to screen people in and out of the study. What was the eligibility criteria? I might have missed that.
There are two tasks here. Participant will get a certain score in each task, and there is some demographic questionnaire. For these two tasks, there is certain numbers, there are certain scores they need to meet to ensure participants will have normal ability of recognizing their own race faces and have poor ability of recognizing other race faces, which means they have the ORE effect, but they have normal facial recognition ability.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep, I understand. Just another quick question as well. Does that screening tool happen to detect prosopagnosia at all?
Yes.
Did you, just out of curiosity, did you happen to find anybody in your study who maybe didn't know that they had that?
There's one person, but for the confidentiality, I can't.
Of course, you can't tell us.
There's one person, so that's very interesting actually. When I saw the scores of everyone, I'm the god to judge your facial recognition.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Nice. Thanks for your question.
I got a small question. I think you already know the answer for this, I guess. Why did you use Asian race rather looking on any African or Indian race? Is there any particular reason? I know you know the answer. Just to make sure.
Of course, on one hand, the questionnaire we have in the experimental flow, the chart here is CMFT Chinese. So it's more accessible for us to just use Asian participants, because Chinese belongs to Asian groups. And on the other hand, at ANU, most of the international students, 80 of them are Chinese. So it's much easier for us to recruit Asian participants. That's why, yeah.
Yep, perfect.
Do we have any other questions? Again, you can put your questions in the chat or raise your hand and we can unmute you.
Hi, I was just wondering if this effect was maintained for mixed race individuals.
For mixed race individuals, you mean like their parents from different ancestors?
Yeah.
That's a very good question. In our study, the participants we have, some of them, they have parents from different countries. The demographic questionnaire we use in our experiments is just to make sure they don't be exposed to white faces a lot before they came to Australia to study. It doesn't matter where their parents come from. So I guess the answer I give it to you will be yes.
Thank you.
Nice.
Okay, I'll give one last call. We do have slightly longer for questions if there are any further questions. Otherwise, we'll move to the next presentation. Okay, it doesn't seem like we have any further questions. So thank you for that presentation. And now we'll move on to our final presentation.
I just stop screen, share the screen.
No worries, thank you. So our final presentation today is from Olivia Maurice. So please start when you're ready.
So hi everyone, it's lovely to virtually meet you all. My name's Olivia Maurice. Welcome to the presentation for my essay entitled Australia, We Have a Problem, Evaluating Neuropsychological Assessment Approaches for Diverse Populations. So humans are inherently diverse. As we know, we are social animals with unique interests and aspirations, cultural and geographical origins, and language backgrounds. Ultimately, it's this cultural richness and sense of collective identity which unifies us profoundly. Our vast range of cultural and linguistic identities influence us significantly on a day-to-day basis. Despite this, in the discipline of psychology, particularly neuropsychological assessment, there's a void in which both practitioners and clinical research fails to account for the role of culture in language. Neuropsychological assessment is the process of evaluating brain behavior relationships and subsequent intervention. This involves medical, educational and occupational history review, interviews, observation, and psychological testing. Throughout the development of neuropsychology as a field, assessment has predominantly normed Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, or weird, populations functioning. This effectively omitted culturally and linguistically diverse, or CALD, backgrounds from test development. This produced bias, misdiagnosis, and poor representativeness, and is still alarmingly prevalent in the literature. For instance, performance discrepancies can be widely observed between clinical and non-clinical weird and CALD samples for weird norm tests, particularly for Spanish, Chinese, Maori, and Vietnamese participants, and misdiagnosis on cognitive impairment screening. So current Australian demographic shifts have heightened the demand for inclusive neuropsychological services, which provide accurate diagnoses, identify treatment needs, and track clients' progress. This essay reviewed 35 peer-reviewed publications obtained through the Macquarie University Peer Review Research Library and aimed to evaluate approaches adopted by clinicians for diverse populations, as well as the factors influencing their validity. We specifically explored the efficacy of norming existing tests for CALD populations, novel CALD-tailored tests, and diversity-centric clinical training or continuing professional development. After all, Australia is commonly referred to as a melting pot, so why don't our neuropsychological services and test data mirror this? Developing and adjusting CALD-specific norms were found to have catalyzed significant improvement in assessment, diagnosis, and intervention. Norm development involves administering existing test batteries to weird and CALD clinical and non-clinical samples to ascertain and ethically adjust for discrepancies influenced by cultural background, language, or education. This informs the data regarding CALD-specific cognitive and behavioural functioning, impairment, and treatment efficacy. By doing this, we can eliminate item bias and non-representative norms. Adjusted norms are critical for improving existing neuropsychological measures, accessibility, and utility for CALD individuals. hence the increase in norming studies for standardized tests on domains like attention, executive function, memory, processing speed, and language. Our review particularly found that both empirical and meta-analytical studies supported robust criterion, factorial, convergent, discriminant, and concurrent validity for Cowd norm measures such as the Wechsler Memory and Intelligence Scale, particularly for the matrix reasoning and digital symbol subtests. However, for immigrants living in weird dominant populations, applying homeland norms can produce poor diagnostic and external validity due to intracultural variance, acculturation, and migration history. The reviewed research widely demonstrated that for Chinese Australians, acculturation-mediated variance in performance on measures like the Bray Complex Figure Test and the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale 3. This effect was attributed to partial assimilation to adopted homeland norms, and it remained after controlling for age, education, and writing system complexity. Cultural cohort effects like differing subcultures, regional language, and history also significantly predicted within group differences for Cowd groups on non-verbal and visuospatial tests like the mini mental status examination. Similarly, tailored cross-cultural tests were found to be easily translatable and required little to no adaptation as they used universally relevant stimuli and or items such as eggs and leaves. These tests also included few verbal items to mitigate translation difficulties. This can be seen in the Kimberley Indigenous Cognitive Assessment and International Shopping List test, which consistently demonstrated robust test-retest reliability and construct and cross-cultural validity for Indigenous and Cowd Australian samples. This emphasis on universal relevance is integral to the reliability and validity of such tests. For example, the European Cross-Cultural Neuropsychological Test Battery, the Roland Universal Dementia Assessment, and Cross-Cultural Dementia Screening demonstrate high sensitivity across multicultural clinical samples via inclusion of culture fair items. So this refers to items which eliminate educational, cultural, and language biases in favour of assessing culture-independent attributes like logical reasoning, learning, processing speed, inhibition, attention, and total delayed and retention-weighted recall. Despite this, the literature showed a trend of administering tests using technologies like computers, wearable devices, and tablets. This threatened external and universal validity by failing to account for developing regions, illiteracy, educational background, technological and economic accessibility, and ecological demands. Resultantly, future test development should use cost-effective, accessible measures, thus optimizing the external validity. Emerging approaches have also accommodated diverse backgrounds through cross-cultural education for organisations and individual practitioners. This fosters acquisition of culturally appropriate communication skills, diagnostic ability, and enhanced intervention. This includes ethical practice standards requiring test designers, administrators, and clinicians to be fluent in the target population's language and culture. This may also require training and non-psychometric assessments like behavioural scales, tests of recall on oral tradition or cultural practices, and qualitative approaches, which provide accurate and valid assessment for Cowd groups lacking solid psychometric tradition. And this mitigates assessment administration difficulties and markedly improves diagnostic validity for groups like Indigenous Australians. The literature also showed that by educating clinicians on ethno-racial neuroimaging and biofluid biomarkers, this significantly strengthened the sensitivity and external validity of diverse assessment. This recognises that intercultural variance within neuropsychopathology, and it improves the quality of cognitive testing, particularly validity in dementia assessments, including Alzheimer's disease. Despite this, cross-cultural education is limited regarding widespread implementation, especially within training, professional practice, and wider organisations involved in assessment and accreditation. These oversights indicate a broader bias, hence the disproportion of Cowd clinicians and supervisors to Cowd patients. Consequently, improving cross-cultural education is essential for providing both individual and systemic solutions to inadequate psychometric tools, workforce representation, and tailored services. In sum, these approaches used by clinicians to assess diverse individuals have significant merit and utility. Despite this, the validity and efficacy have been diminished by factors including poor accessibility and representativeness, acculturation, intercultural variance, migration history, and limited Cowd-specific training, Accordingly, current and future inquiry should develop norms, implement inclusive clinical training, and tailor tests for Indigenous, multiracial, migrant, and acculturated groups. This may involve qualitative assessments to supplement conventional methodologies. And through this action, Australian neuropsychological services can improve inclusivity by tailoring care for diverse patients. Thank you. I'll be taking questions now.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll now have 5 minutes for Q&A. Again, I'll invite the judges first if you have any questions.
Yep, I can just ask a quick question. I was just wondering with your method, how you identified those publications?
Yep, so we have a search engine at Macquarie University for peer-reviewed publications, and the search criteria was that they assessed CALD Australians specifically, and basically with those 3 different areas that we were researching in, which was new tests and then adjusted norms and then clinical training. So there were those separate criteria that I had to find separately, and basically identify the trends among the research in those specific areas.
So was it sort of, was this a systematic review or just sort of followed a sort of semi-systematic approach?
So this was an essay, but a semi-review.
Yeah,
so,
okay.
Yeah, not as structured as a more robust meta-analysis, but yeah.
Cool, thank you.
No worries.
Okay, do we have any other questions?
I found, oh, sorry.
No, that's fine. I mean, like, it's a good presentation, nice presentation, Olivia. You have done quite a lot of work searching all through, like, all these publications and stuff. I got no question. I just want to, like, wish you good luck with all the future.
Thank you very much. I hope to continue cross-cultural research, especially in the neuropsychological field. I think it's very under-researched, and the fact we only found 35 that really addressed it robustly, that's a problem. So, yeah.
It's perfect.
Hi, sorry. I also found this presentation really interesting because I'm focusing on neuropsychological tasks too. So, you said that you were mainly looking at new tasks, adjusted norms, and clinical training to improve neuropsychological testing within CALD individuals. Which one do you think would be like the best future direction for this research?
I think it always starts within education, because that does spark the desire for clinicians to actually go out there and implement this, and then that will kind of feed into the new tests. I think there's a very serious lack of education for cross-cultural training. I mean, I've just finished my undergrad and there was no mention of it at all, apart from electives that you take that were not in the discipline. So I think it all starts with education and diversifying the curriculum in order to cater specifically to groups such as Indigenous people and migrant acculturated groups. So there are different levels to it, and you obviously have to have modules that are tailored specifically to each group in order to kind of provide the appropriate intervention.
Thank you.
No worries.
Do we have any further questions? Just give it a moment to see if there are any last questions. Okay, it doesn't look like there are though. So that brings us to the end of today's session. I'd like to thank our judges for today. Chemikara Liange and Amelia Gulliver. So thank you to both of you. And thank you to our presenters as well. The recording of this session will be available following the conference, and we hope to see you at other conference sessions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.